Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing my predictions for the upcoming NHL play-in tournament involving the middle 16 teams of the league, trying to see who can get to the real top 16 playoffs. So, one important thing to talk about before I actually get into these predictions is sort of my thought process behind how this is going to go. Now, normally going into a playoffs, teams will have finished their 82-game regular season. They'll have maybe 3 or 4 days off to mentally reset, a bit of rest, before heading into what could, for at least the teams that make it far, potentially be a very grueling 1.5 months to potentially even 2 months. For instance, the St. Louis Blues, the Stanley Cup champions last season, played 26 games, which is a lot when you consider how intense these playoff hockey games can get compared to the regular season, where games will sometimes lack that type of energy. There are certainly games in the regular season that do bring that type of playoff feel to them, but it's definitely not coming to any surprises to anyone that there are certain games in the regular season, especially games between two different teams and two different conferences. So for instance, from a Sharks perspective, let's say the Sharks versus the Florida Panthers, you can absolutely tell that is not the energy of a playoff game compared to in the playoffs. It seems as though the energy is always very, very high. Now, that's easy to do because you're coming off of an 82-game regular season. You're already warmed up, and so coming into the playoffs, it's pretty easy to get up to speed. But at the moment, in the current situation, teams did not just have 4 days off, they had over 4 months off. And this was sort of like an off season for many teams. Teams have not played since around mid-March, and they will start playing once more here late July for exhibition games, and the actual tournament starts the 1st of August. And so it's hard to imagine that a lot of teams who really depend on the systems that they play to actually do well will be really able to get their intensity up to what a normal playoff level intensity is, which is why I think a lot of these teams that will benefit from the current situation will be the teams that are just very good on paper, that just sort of have a lot of innate skill in their lineup. So for instance, I think a very good example of this is the Toronto Maple Leafs. Now, the Maple Leafs certainly aren't the best team out of these 16, but I feel like they might be doing the best, at least at the start, so in this play-ins, just because players like Matthews, Marner, Tavares, these players don't necessarily need so much time to try and get up to speed. This is not a team that's built on a system that really needs to get rolling. This is a team that just has very good players who will likely be very good right out of the gate. Compared to a team like the New York Islanders, this is a team that is heavily invested into the system that their coach Barry Trotz instilled in them last season. They did quite well for themselves last season. They've done pretty well for themselves this season, but I just don't know how quickly they can get to a competitive playoff level to compete with these extremely skilled teams when they've had such a massive break in the as a sort of off season. So it's hard to imagine that a team like the Islanders or maybe a team like the Blue Jackets could really get up to speed and compete with some of these teams that will just be easily better than them on paper. So starting off with my predictions, it is the Penguins versus the Canadiens, the top seed in the Eastern Conference against the bottom seed in the Eastern Conference, and I predict the Penguins will be able to win in just 4 games. Of course, all these series are best of 5s. I think the Canadiens can probably steal one. Of course, they have the wild card that is Carey Price, and it's possible that he'll be good enough to backstop the Canadiens to at least one victory in this series, but I just think the Penguins, as I've said, are just a better team on paper with the likes of Crosby, with the likes of Malkin. I don't think the Canadiens can really compete with that type of firepower, and as I said, it's to me going to be a tournament based a lot on skill, and the Penguins just have a lot more of it than the Canadiens. Next is the Hurricanes and the Rangers, and this could potentially be an interesting one. The Rangers were a team in the regular season that were known for very good offense, but were also said to have one of the worst defensive units, sort of defensive play styles in the entire league. Now, that will matter coming in, as of course they likely will end up giving up some goals to the Hurricanes, but I think it'll matter slightly less than it would have going into a normal playoffs if the Rangers were to have made a normal playoffs, which I don't think they would have. But I think the Hurricanes will be able to stave off the offensive pressure from the Rangers. Players like Panarin and Zibanejad will likely have very good series, but I think the Hurricanes will just be able to come together that much more than the Rangers and win out in 5 games. Next, I have the Panthers and the Islanders, and while the Islanders I do have the higher seed, as I explained earlier, I don't know if they're going to be able to compete with a team like the Panthers. I think one thing that's also going to benefit the Panthers heavily is when it comes to Sergey Bobrowski, who had been having a very bad regular season. Normally with a 4-game reset from regular season to playoffs, you don't really expect much else, but considering that the teams have not played for over 4 months, it's possible Bobrowski could actually have a sort of turnaround and actually, become that goaltender that the Panthers thought they were going to get when they signed him to over $10 million in terms of a contract. And so I think with the Panthers' skill, they have that over the Islanders. I don't know how quickly the Islanders are going to be able to come together. I gave the Islanders a single game, and it's possible that I could be completely off base with my predictions and the Islanders will end up winning this series, but for now, I think the Panthers can take it in 4. And a similar thing comes for the Leafs and the Blue Jackets, as this is the only sweep I'm predicting on the board. I don't know how good the Blue Jackets are going to end up being. They were pretty solid during the regular season, but after a disastrous offseason, many people thought they were going to be a basement team. They surprised, but with this massive break, I don't know how well they're going to be able to get back up to speed. And the Leafs are just an innately skilled team. Matthews, Tavares, Marner. I'd be surprised if this series doesn't go any less than or any more than 4 games, let's just say. If it goes to 5, I'd be pretty surprised. Next in the Western Conference would be the Oilers versus the Blackhawks. This could potentially be the most fun series to watch. I think both these teams have extremely skilled players. The Blackhawks are sort of like the Rangers, but maybe a bit better in some ways, just because I don't think their defense is as awful as the Rangers is. But the Blackhawks are a pretty heavily offensive team. So are the Oilers, but the Oilers managed to also clean up their back end. But coming into this play-in series, I think both these teams will be extremely high scoring. It'll be interesting to watch McDavid and Draisaitl on one side. It'll be interesting to watch Patrick Kane on the other side. But I think the Oilers are just overall the slightly better team, which is why I do give them the edge in this 5-game series. But this could actually be a pretty big upset if the Blackhawks do win, because of course the Oilers were the top seed in this play-in series for the Western Conference. Next, I have the Predators versus the Coyotes. Of course, I have the Predators winning in 4 games. These teams are sort of similar in some ways, just that they don't necessarily excel super well in offense and maybe rely a bit more on their defensive backside. The Predators, of course, have a very, very good defensive core, while the Coyotes maybe rely a bit more on their coaching to try and get them. Now, the Coyotes do have a couple of wild cards, of course. Phil Kessel and Taylor Hall do both play for the Coyotes, and while they haven't been lighting it up because of the Coyotes system during the regular season, it's possible that if that system does fall apart somewhat, maybe the Kessel, maybe Hall, maybe their skill can really shine through and get them a game versus the Predators, but I just don't really see how they can end up winning this series, which is why I have the Predators in 4. Next will be the Canucks versus the Wild. Now, this could also be one of the most interesting series of the play-ins. Both of these teams I feel like are quite evenly matched. It was a complete toss-up to me who would actually win this series. I decided to go with the Canucks because they were the higher seed, and they do have probably the most skilled player in this matchup, which is Elias Pettersson. However, as I said, this could really go either way. Maybe the Wild can figure out their goaltending, because during the regular season, it seemed to be Alex Stalock had somehow won out on the regulars as the starting goaltender, and Devin Dubnyk had fallen apart. But for all we know, something could happen there. Devin Dubnyk could really win that spot back, and maybe that gives the Wild enough of an edge to beat the Canucks. But right now, I've got the Canucks in 5. And finally, the Jets versus the Flames, also a pretty interesting series. I feel as though the Jets will be able to, however, take it in 4 games. Both of these teams are pretty evenly matched on offense, and while the defensive side does go to the Flames, I think the goaltending heavily leans towards the Jets. Of course, Connor Hellebuck, one of the best goalies in the regular season this past year, and while there has been this 4-month break, so that could affect it somewhat, I'd still put much more faith in Connor Hellebuck than I would in David Rittich for the Calgary Flames, which is why, while the Flames probably can get a game, I'd say the Jets take it in 4. But that would do it for this play-ins. I'm not going to review the round robin. It really doesn't have much stakes to it. Yes, it affects the seeding and how those 4 teams in each conference will actually match up against which 4 teams win here in each conference for the play-ins. But there isn't really, a team that does poorly in the round robin doesn't mean they're going to do poorly in the playoffs, so I don't really see a need to predict it. But these play-ins, maybe I'll be completely off base with my predictions and just how they're going to go down, in the fact that I don't think teams are going to be able to get up to speed in terms of system, and skill will likely win out, but I guess we'll see what happens. Class dismissed.